Welcome to Jewish Philosophy Matters. My name is Simi Lerner, and I'm sitting here with, or at least digitally, with Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein and Reb Chaim Eisen. What we're going to do is discuss a topic, a question that I'm going to pose to both these Rabbonim, and they're going to put forward 5 or 6 minutes of an answer, and then we'll open it up for discussion. That's the goal of this podcast. But beforehand, I'm going to give a short introduction to why Jewish philosophy matters. And then, what is the value or the why of this dialogue? To begin with, why does Jewish philosophy matter? Well, we have to ask the question, what is Jewish philosophy? And without opening that can of worms, because we want to get to the discussion as soon as possible, Jewish philosophy is basically, and this is obviously going to be a contentious definition, but for the purposes of our discussion, Jewish philosophy is taking a set of givens. That set of givens is the Torah, however it is going to be described, written and oral, and it's been structured, it's been organized primarily by the Rishonim, and then later on further developed by the Achronim. Of course, the Gaonim are in there as well. This structuring, this categorization, is done on the body that is Torah. That allows us to ask questions, that allows us to apply the Torah to our lives in a meaningful way, but also understand questions and concepts that aren't readily apparent without this sort of structuring. That's Jewish philosophy. And why does it matter? Because without it, you can't live a life of Judaism, and you can't understand the concepts within Judaism. Why is this dialogue important? Because we have two thinkers. If you take if we use a metaphor that my wife suggested, Rivka suggested, that if we take a orchestra, you have a set of instruments in front of you. A conductor is the one who uses different instruments at different times, emphasizes different notes at different times. Before us, we have two thinkers who approach the body that is Judaism in different ways. Thereby, the way they conduct, the way they interact with the set of givens before them will be different. They're all using the same set of givens, but ones they choose to emphasize, areas they choose to focus on will be different. That perhaps is a loose metaphor to how two different thinkers can give us two genuine, but at the same time, different approaches to questions on Jewish philosophy. And at the same time, having them both engage with each other allows the ideas to be sharpened, allows the ideas to, when you have metal and you rub it against metal, it becomes sharper. That same concept can be applied to an idea. If an idea sits in isolation in your head, it never gets challenged. It never is given the opportunity to develop. We want to have that space over here, that opportunity to have two great thinkers put their ideas together and see what comes from it. And thereby you as the audience can experience that and build your own worldview. That, by way of short introduction, we're going to open with our first question. And this will be addressed to both Rabbi Yitzchak and Reb Chaim Eisen. The question is, right now, in 2003, in November 2nd, the Jewish people are faced with difficult times. Tragedy, horror, anxiety, all the worst emotions, and at the same time, some of the beautiful ideas and beautiful emotions that come along with through the struggle and the battle. The good comes with the bad, and this complex experiencing of the unity of the Klal Yisrael, and at the same time, the horror that we're experiencing as a people and that we have experienced. All this comes together for the Jewish people to do something. Now, besides the hishtadlus that we're doing on the ground and that the army is doing, we are also encouraged to do our religious duty, and that's often focused in on prayer. Prayer, Talmud Torah, Gemilas Chasodim. These come together as the religious obligation of the Jew at this time. The question I want to ask is, when we're asked to engage in prayer, how are we supposed to structure that as being effective? What is happening? I'm reading words. I'm feeling emotions. How is that effective on the ground? What construct, what way of putting together the simple idea of praying to the Almighty, how is that going to be effective? What mechanism can you explain, can we use to break that down? And thereby allow the individual who's engaging in prayer, make it meaningful and emotive. Reb Chaim Eisen.
Okay, Thank you very much, Rosimi. To resonate with the introduction that you gave, I'd like to first consider the parameters of prayer in terms of the halachic undergirding that ultimately informs, obviously, our philosophical understanding. So what I suspect is fairly well known is the dissension between Rambam and Ramban regarding the mitzvah of prayer, which Rambam reckons as one of the 613 commandments of the Torah. And Ramban either does or does not. By which, of course, I mean that Ramban, in his critique of Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, famously dissents with Rambam, who reckons the mitzvah of prayer as the fifth mitzvah in Sefer HaMitzvot. And he presents two alternative possibilities in contrast with Rambam's view. The first is that there is no mitzvah of prayer of the Torah. It is rather an opportunity to turn to the Almighty in times of distress. The second is that there is a mitzvah of prayer. You might think that means that either he dissents or he doesn't, but no, in either case he dissents. Because in this mitzvah of prayer, the mitzvah of prayer is to turn to the Almighty in time of distress. And for Rambam, the mitzvah of prayer is essentially part of one's daily regimen. That is, one has an obligation to say something that will include within it words of praise, words of supplication, words of thanksgiving on a daily basis. In some sense, what Rambam is describing then is, if you will, a monologue. It's part of the daily regimen. Ramban is speaking of a dialogue, turning to the Almighty in time of distress. So is there a fundamental dissension between Rambam and Ramban with respect to the whole enterprise of approaching the Almighty? It's important to stress that the answer categorically is no, because while there definitely is a dissension between them with respect to the parameters of the mitzvah of prayer, when one considers what Ramban is stating with respect to the turning to the Almighty in time of distress, I must state that it seems transparently clear to me that Ramban's source needs to be found far closer to home in this dissension with Rambam. And I'll just note very briefly here, not so much a contrast between Rambam and Ramban, but rather a contrast between Rambam and Rambam. That is, there's another mitzvah, the mitzvah that is enunciated in the Torah in Parashat Beha'alotcha with respect to the trumpets, V'hariotem b'chatzotzerot. And Rambam addresses this mitzvah in three different contexts in his literary legacy. The first of which is in Sefer HaMitzvot. And Sefer HaMitzvot, not the mitzvah of prayer, the mitzvah of litkoa b'chatzotzrot, which is positive mitzvah number 59. There's a mitzvah, shetzivanu litkoa b'chatzotzrot. And as a sub-component of that mitzvah, he notes that we are commanded to blow these trumpets in time of travail when we call out to Hashem. That's the formulation in Sefer Mitzvot. We move on to the next major compilation, which is in Rambam's Mishnah Torah, the Halachic Code, at the beginning of Hilchot Ta'niyot, where Rambam enunciates the positive mitzvah to which we just referred, except here he expresses differently. Mitzvah Taseh Torah liz'ok ul'hariyah b'chatzotzrot. First, no, to scream out, and then also, of course, to blow the trumpets. Al kol tzarash tava tzibur, whenever travail befalls the community. So, is this second source the underlying hidden source of Ramban in his dissension, ironically, with Rambam and Sefer Mitzvot? Answer: no. This is only the second stage. The third stage is in Rambam's philosophical magnum opus, Moreh Nevuchim, Guide to the Perplexed. In the third unit of the guide, Rambam takes all the 613 commandments of the Torah, divides them into 14 major categories for the purpose of understanding what the conceptual ramifications, the tamei mitzvot of these commandments is. The first category is foundational intellectual doctrines, and Rambam includes Hilchot Ta'aniyot, this mitzvah, in that first category. And the way he describes it in Moreh Nevuchim is HaMitzvah asher tzivanu litzok elav yitbarach be'et tzara, to scream out to God in times of distress, which is almost verbatim what Ramban says in his critique of Rambam's definition of the mitzvah of prayer in Sefer HaMitzvot. Bottom line here is that from Rambam's perspective, it's a different mitzvah. It's not the mitzvah of prayer, but there is a mitzvah to call out to God in time of distress. And what might we think otherwise, after all, when we consider the whole corpus of Judaism? Just as a case in point, many people are reciting Tehillim on a daily basis today, and one of the favorites, which we in any case recite daily, is Psalm 20, Mizmor Kaf. So we recite the words, Ele varechev ve'ele basusim, va'anachnu b'shem Hashem Elokeinu nazkir. So they're coming at us with the tanks of yesteryear, that is the horses and the chariots, and we are coming mentioning, recounting the name of Hashem Elokeinu. And that leads to the next verse. That they were bowed over and fell, and we arose and were encouraged. There's a causative relationship between these two psukim. If someone doesn't believe that, excuse me, we're not on the same page. We're not talking Judaism anymore. So it's important for us to recognize that as the starting point. Of course, we need to consider in the literature, really going back to Chazal, what we understand with respect to the theurgic efficacy of prayer. But if we don't have this as the starting point, we're not in the ballpark. This is the ballpark.
Okay, thank you. Before we unpack that, I want to hand it to Rabbi Yitzchak to present his perspective on the same topic or the same question.
Yeah, I'm not as nice a guy as Reb Chaim, so I'm interested in getting past the foundational and more into the experiential, and to answer directly the issue of the issue that pains so many people. Yeah, we know that Reb Chaim is saying it's correct, and there is no Yiddishkeit without prayer, and we know that it's a central pillar and theme of Yiddishkeit. But how the heck does it work? Why does it make any difference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What do you mean for that matter? These are questions that were first posed by Rishonim, and there are a few answers out there. But one of the areas where I might part company with Rav Chaim is where I go for some of the answers. I have less patience than he does, so I may go straight to some of the handier formulations of people closer to our time, without disagreeing with any of the foundational material of Rav Chaim. So we find that there are so many different approaches to how Tefillah works, why God cares, why do we have to verbalize, why does it make any difference? Either we deserve it or we don't deserve it, and God knows what we need, so he's going to give it to us. And, there are a bunch of approaches we could look at. Some of them one of them, a major approach, is kind of a mystical approach, that we are partners with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ever since HaKadosh Baruch Hu stopped creating in the 6 days, he's left everything else up to us. So we mirror HaKadosh Baruch Hu's creativity by every day building, as it were, reconstructing the world by bringing down a divine shefa from HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the different olamos and finally into our world. There, I'd say at the other end of the spectrum is the idea that prayer is completely man-centered, meaning that it doesn't work unless we do something to ourselves. Rav Yosef Albo's famous formulation of a town where the king sends his messengers, better speak to your insurance salesman and to your local mortuary, because 30 days from now, we're going to come through this town and we're going to execute everyone with black socks. And of course, everyone in that town wears black socks and people are despondent. Oh, what are we going to do? We're all going to die, until one person says, hey, why don't we change the color of our socks? And that tefillah essentially means becoming a different person, which is a very tall order. It means that tefillah, in essence, doesn't really work unless we've made some kind of meaningful change in ourselves every time that we daven. There are other approaches. An approach that I would like to showcase is that of Maharal. I guess that's no surprise to anybody who knows me. The Maharal is a beautiful formulation of the efficacy of tefillah, of how it works, and that is that tefillah is the complete subjugation of a person to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the realization of our complete helplessness without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, recognizing that we are powerless to do anything in this universe because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not the big guy in the sky who can help us out, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the oneness, the one who is unlike everything else. That by praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in complete hachna'ah, recognizing that we have nothing really to bring to the table, that is liberating, because in doing so, we recognize more of who HaKadosh Baruch Hu is and turn ourselves into vessels, into kelim that can hold more of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's shefa. That when we do this, we're not only helping our own personal spiritual journey, but we in fact are contributing to the overall purpose of life itself, which, as the Ramchal teaches, ultimately is exposing the reality of Yichud Hashem, of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what we do in davening, and that's how it can work. And that is a goal. That is something that it's not something that you do 100% all the time, but it is a framework of tefillah that I think is particularly rewarding, even though it wasn't expressed that way entirely in the words of the Rishonim, to whom we are forever indebted, and that Rav Chaim will take me to task for not emphasizing.
Okay, thank you. So if I would pose a question, so from Rav Chaim Eisen's standpoint, we had perhaps the ontological description of the reality behind us, the different categories of commandments and how they act. Then we had the existential perspective, what it means to be a person in prayer. And Rabbi Yitzchak gave us the, I suppose you could say, the three approaches. We had the Shepa approach, the approach of these energies, which I'm sure we can unpack to realize that that, to an extent, only really pushes the question off slightly further, because the same question still applies to that mechanism of what is going on there. It's just it's not just, God forbid, it's a repetition of mechanism. But the other two, if we would look at them, one is the empowering of man through teshuvah, which I'm sure there perhaps is a connection with the teshuvah, which is the idea of self-change. You change thereby. And the other one from the Maharal, which was more of the lessening of the self, but I found the beauty of that was it was able to work itself towards the goal. And that goal orientation of it means that the efficacy of prayer could work. So in terms of posing a question, if I put this to both of you now in the sense of a discussion, but began with Reb Chaim, with what was said and what you were given, of these approaches, which one would you say fits most in line with your perspective?
I certainly am very much beholden to the sources that Rav Yitzchak cited. If I may, I'd just like to note briefly, since he has shifted the focus of the discussion to more recent sources than those with which I began, that there is an interesting convergence of sorts between Maharal in a different passage and a more recent author to whom I feel very much beholden despite his recent status in terms of chronology, namely of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. That is, Maharal in Be'er Golah speaks of the root of Tefillah, the root being Palel, and understands it as referring to a thought process. That Hulashon Machshava, which is in a way similar, even though I am fairly convinced that Rav Hirsch was unaware of Maharal's writings because they really weren't extant in his time, despite the time that had elapsed in the interim. When Rav Hirsch analyzes Palel as referring to judging, and the way he expresses it, the judge brings justice and right, the divine truths of matters into the matter, makes it go into and penetrate all phases of the dispute, and by true justice brings about a harmonious unity into that which without it was clamoring dissension. So you can describe this as teshuvah, as you did, Rav Simi, but I think it's a more fundamental sense of the role of tefillah being imposing divine truths on myself and ultimately on the world. So it is indeed transformative in much the same vein as what Rav Yitzchak cited famously in the name of Rav Yosef Albo, but I would still regard it more as consonant in particular with the manner in which Rambam posits the mitzvah of tefillah, as opposed to the mitzvah of screaming out, which is the mitzvahs associated with the trumpets at the beginning of Hilchot Ta'aniyot. That mitzvah that is essentially to impose a regimen on one's day, on one's life. Not at all incidentally, the mitzvah of tefillah, as opposed to Hilchot Ta'aniyot, is in Sefer Ahava. Hilchot Tefillah is in Sefer Ahava in Rambam, and what ultimately is the meaning of Sefer Ahava, the mitzvot in it, with one exception. Rambam relegates to the 9th category in Tamei Mitzvot in Moran Nevuchim, and he describes it essentially forging a religious personality, immersing oneself in essentially religious experience, which, if I may submit, is not so far away from what Rabbi Yitzchak said with respect to Maharal, and I'll also add, not at all remote from the manner in which Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in Sefer Kuzari, when the king solicits from the Chaver a description of the Chassid, the archetypal pietist, in the 3rd Ma'amar of Sefer Kuzari, in Siman Hey, describes how the Chassid gets ready for prayer. That experience is transformative. And arguably it's transformative precisely because it becomes part of our routine. So the routine is going to be transformative? Yes. The greatest thing that routine gives you, a holy routine, is it puts your entire plane of existence on a different level. And I think we all on some plane feel this. I mean, I certainly feel that that's what tefillah is, maybe more than anything else. It's something we have to do every day. You have to get up, even if you don't want to get up, you get up. And you got to go to shul, Maybe you don't want to go to shul. I mean, there's such a thing as tefillah biyachid, but we aim to daven with the tzibur, and you have these external parameters that are essentially more than anything else what is imposed upon us by the regimen of Hilchot Tefillah, and that in and of itself is transformative.
Okay.
I would like to say that I am shocked into speechlessness. That was a very, very clever maneuver of using one of my favorites of Shamshon Fall Hirsch in a way I never expected to hear it, as confirming words of Rishonim through fairly recent Acharonim. I'm cheering from the sidelines, but I'm left almost speechless. As I'm trying to recover, I will say just to your credit, the citation from Shamshon Fall Hirsch actually says more about the last point that you made than you've actually taken credit for. Shamshon Fall Hirsch mentions that the relationship between Pei Lamed Lamed and Beis Lamed Lamed, which he sees as having to be connected, is that there are many truths that we know, and those truths are sustaining of us. Your idea that you can be transformative simply by reminding yourself of things that you know but have slipped into the background of your consciousness rather than the foreground, and that is what Tefillah is supposed to accomplish. I would say that again, wandering into your territory, the Ibn Ezra says one place that the urge to Tefillah, the idea that we have an opportunity to speak, to address HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so different from the concept of what a God was in the ancient world, but that Kaviyachol, we have HaKadosh Baruch Hu's attention, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu guarantees to us that he listens. And Terem Yikru Vaniene, Rav Chaim Volozhin says, I mean, think of the beauty of that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will answer before you even begin speaking to him, because what you're really looking for is closeness to him, and that he guarantees that. The Ibn Ezra says that by right, we should be so taken in by the idea of living, as it were, in the same universe as Kaviyachol, that we would do nothing else but pray. And that sort of Bechaste Hashem, he's told us that we can get away with it by just addressing him a couple of times a day. And I don't think he's implying that 3 tefillos a day is the Eraisa, but he says it's apparently the will of the Torah that we find discrete times in our lives, in our daily pattern, where we address HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that we're not overcome with his presence so to the extent that we're unable to do anything else. So when you look at it that way, whether you see this as HaKadosh Baruch Hu's full original intention or not, Tefillah becomes so important in the life of a Jew that we're now sort of back to the beginning again. So here we are in a time of crisis. We came into it making 100 brachas a day, davening 3 Shmona Esreis a day, conscious of where we have to pay more attention, where we have to have more kavanah. Now we're in a national time of existential crisis, worried about the very continuity of Medinat Yisrael, of the largest Jewish community in the world, and at the same time davening for all those people we know who are on the front risking their lives, and that some of them, b'derech hatev, are not going to make it back, and crying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What are our thoughts in Tefillah? How do we make that Tefillah more potent? How do we see it as relevant, particularly in a time like today? So I'll let you answer that before I do it myself.
If I may just depend on another side to the coin, that is, with respect to, on the one hand, this desire to be entirely immersed exclusively in tefillah, maybe another side of the coin, if you will. when Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in the same passage where he describes the Chassid preparing himself for Tefillah, establishes an analogy between prayer and eating 3 meals a day, davening 3 times a day. What's the obvious undergirding of the analogy? So you could say, I davened once, why do I have to daven again? But then I ate once, why do I have to eat again? Of course, the question is silly. The reason is because I ate once, but the various encumbrances of my life deplete me. Whatever energy I received from one meal, the batteries got charged and now they've become depleted. I have to eat again. Same thing with respect to the spiritual batteries. That is, if I wouldn't be engaged in the relentless confrontation with the vagaries of life in this world, in Achinami, the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, because he's really Torah Torah, doesn't have to daven. Whereas for all the rest of us, the very confrontation itself is spiritually depleting. And Tefillah, more than anything else, is the opportunity to refill those spiritual batteries. And to that extent, it's not just the enterprise of Tefillah itself, it's that Tefillah is enabling me to sally forth and do everything that I am summoned to do as an Oved Hashem over the course of my life.
So you didn't answer the question.
From my perspective,
Are there any particular differences, any particular chiyuvim, any particular attitudes that we take into our tefillah at this historical moment? The answer could be no. I'll live with that.
I mean, look, obviously, the whole premise that Ha'oseh Tfilato Keva and Tfilato Tachnunim means that under all circumstances, we need to confront the world in which we are residing in order to appreciate how to orient our tefillos. I remember an elderly, eminent Talmid Chacham, a real Yerushalmi, from my youth, Rav Ben Zion Freiman Zichrono Livracha. In one of the Hespedim, when he left this world, the Rosh Yeshiva recounted how he comes to the Beis Midrash early in the morning before Shacharis, and he sees that Rav Freiman is looking for a newspaper. He was so not shaykh to a newspaper. And he said in all utmost seriousness, he's looking to see what he's davening for. That is, for him, that was the hechetimtze for focusing his tefillah. What's going on? When you hear the reports, I don't know what the exact circumstance was on that particular day, but of course there should be a response. What the nature of that response is, that I can't answer. But there should be a process of striving to respond. There should indeed be this deeply rooted cognizance that tefillah makes a difference. What difference? There can be any number of answers to that question. It makes a difference to me, it makes a difference to the world, it makes a difference to my fellow man, it makes a difference with respect to the cosmic reality in which we reside. But tefillah makes a difference. When I do something down here, the gears start turning. What gears? How they turn? I don't necessarily have a clue. But I should be cognizant of the significance of a human being standing in tefillah before the Ribono Shel Olam.
I would return to something that I mentioned before, and this great theme of the Ramchal of the idea of the purpose of existence is Yichud Hashem, and all of Das Tfunos is a roadmap of how we finally get to the ultimate Yichud Hashem. So I see it, just the personal perspective, as an opportunity to do something that we don't always have an opportunity to do. That is, first time really in my adult life, for sure, that this is true. One of the things we say in Avinu Malkeinu is Asay Leman Shemecha. Don't do it for us, but do it for you. And it's something we usually gloss over, and we say, yeah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has kaviyachol, skin in the game also. He has his purposes. But we are now literally in the crosshairs of most of the world, certainly in the sights of most of the world. And how the world sees us and our response is an important part of what we can at least hope for will be the divine response. Meaning, are we acting consonant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's oneness, which we can only do by being one people? Is what emerges from our public posture an idea of greater oneness? If you are out there, atheist, agnostic, or whatever, but somehow this remarkable response of Klal Yisrael says something, hints at the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It is literally Laman Shemecha, that when we can stand before you and daven, maybe with more of a sense of how we fit into Am Yisrael than even looking at our own personal stake in this, which is very hard, especially for those who have close relatives and friends, and sometimes many of them in the same family out there. But to see ourselves as part of a Klal Yisrael that is coming together, and what was it? 200,000 pairs of tzitzis that were delivered to Tzahal in the last 2 weeks. 200,000. The visuals that are getting out, besides the ones that the New York Times is printing, the visuals are of soldiers who are davening, who turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu before battle with such enthusiasm. The asifas of tefillah in other parts of the community, where you can just tell that people are turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is an opportunity that we have that I think is consistent with the approach of the Maral and the Ramchal that I probably botched in turning into one melange, but it's something worthwhile considering. And of course, this conversation has been somewhat exhilarating in the sense that, and I suspect there'll be more of this in future podcasts, that despite the slightly different perspectives, which we'll probably enlarge on some future date between Rabbi Eisen and myself, by the way, we are very good friends, is that so much of what seems different winds up coming back to the same thing. That things that you think are newfangled ideas in modern achronim really harken back to things that are mentioned if you have the right precision and the right diuk in looking at the words of our Rishonim.
I completely agree. And I also completely agree with the point that you made about the current state of Klal Yisrael. I certainly have experienced this personally in terms of inquiries, I'm sure you have as well, from our non-Jewish associates and friends, that is asking about the spiritual tenor here, and very much apropos what you just recounted a couple of weeks ago. Our youngest son reported that on Friday afternoon there was a call-up, so to speak, in their shul in Petach Tikva for men to come to tie tzitzis because there's a run on tzitzis, and they need people to make tzitzis because so many soldiers on the front, obviously soldiers who did not have tzitzis before, are craving to be able to put on tzitzis. Yeah. And it's not just that. There's the whole spiritual tenor that we sense in Klal Yisrael. Obviously, this is an opportunity for the same kind of transformation. Ultimately, I also cast it in terms of the Rishonim. That is the transformative process that Rav Yitzhak mentioned with respect to Rav Yosef Albo, the experience of Tefillah that I'm focusing up on in particular in the words of Sefer Kuzari and also Rambam, that is the whole role of Hilchos Tefillah as being in Sefer Avah to mold our personality as Avdei Hashem. Halavai indeed, which should be a tikkun for us, for Klal Yisrael, for the world at large, for the universe, and ready the world for the final establishment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's kingdom, B'mehera v'yameinu.
Amen. What a great way to conclude.
So there's a quick break and a quick summation of the discussion and what's going to come next in the next week or the next podcast discussion. So we focused on the idea of prayer, the mitzvah of prayer, the mitzvah to cry out to God as being distinct. Rabbi Yitzchok developed the perhaps 3 or 4 later on approaches in terms of focusing in on the mechanism, either the Shafa approach, the reflective approach in terms of developing of the self, or the lessening of the self, but in line with the goal of Judaism as beginning the discussion of some sort of how am I achieving something. The discussion then developed along the lines of how the situation on the ground in our dire circumstances in the here and now actually changes our ability to call out. And you both focused on Rav Hirsch, and just to circle back to the great Rabina, it's actually in this week's parasha he develops it, which is Vayira. Something that both of you mentioned that I think is a good way of ending off is that the less you feel the need to pray, he says, is indicative of your need to pray. If you don't feel you need to, it means that reflection, that development hasn't taken place. You haven't inputted those divine truths, thereby the need to change. And I don't think any of us in today's day and age feel the need that we don't need to pray. We all feel this heavy imperative to pray. So taking that step to the next week's discussion, which will be on the actual focusing in on that movement between what I'm doing and what I hope to change in the world, even though that can't be guaranteed. I have to hope on some level that what I'm doing in the here and now does affect change. And then we'll open that door up to incorporate both Talmud Torah as well as Gemilas Chasodim. Have a wonderful week all.